Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. "We have a request to make," they said. "The Lord God of Israel says, 'Let my people go out into the desert for a festival.'" "I don't know your God," answered the king. "What is it to me? I will not let the Israelites go." The king was angry. "From now on, no one is to give the Israelites the straw they need to mix with the clay to make their bricks," he said. "Let them find their own, and they must make just as many bricks as before." This was terrible. In despair, Moses cried out to God for help. "You will see what I shall do to the king of Egypt," God said. "I am God. I shall make Pharaoh let my people go. I shall set them free, and you will lead them out of Egypt. Go to the king again. Tell him I shall bring terrible trouble on Egypt if he will not do as I ask. Then all Egypt will know that I am really God." Moses and Aaron stood before the king again. "Show me a miracle if you really come from God," he said. So Aaron threw down the strong stick he carried, and it became a snake. But the Egyptian magicians did the same, so the king sent Moses and Aaron away. Then God took action as he had warned. Terrible things began to happen. Every time God sent a warning to the king beforehand, but the king did not believe him. He would not listen. First, the water in the river Nile turned to blood. It smelt dreadful and all the fish died. A week later, the whole land was swarming with frogs. The king begged Moses to take them away, but still he would not let the people go. Next came swarms of insects and flies. They were everywhere except in Goshen, where the Israelites lived. "You can go," cried Pharaoh, but then he changed his mind. Then the cattle began to die, everywhere except in Goshen again. But the king still said no. Everyone had painful boils, even the magicians, but the king still said no. Moses and Aaron stood before him yet again. God says, "You have seen my power. There is more trouble to come if you do not let the Israelites go. Tomorrow there will be hail." No one had ever seen hail like it. It flattened the crops and it killed the cattle out in the fields. The hail fell everywhere except in Goshen. Next came swarms of locusts, which ate up every green thing. And after that, pitch darkness for 3 whole days. But the king still tried to bargain with God. He would not let his people go. Let the people go. Then the most terrible thing of all happened. In a single night, the eldest son of every family in Egypt died, from the king's son and heir to the son of his lowest slave. But in Goshen, the Israelites were safe. God had told them what to do. Every Israelite family had killed a lamb that night and splashed some of the blood on the doorposts of their house. They roasted the lamb and ate it with herbs and flat loaves of bread made quickly without any yeast, and death passed over their houses. That is why, forever after, once a year, the people of Israel ate this special Passover meal and remembered how God had saved them. Next day, the Egyptians could not wait to get rid of the Israelites. They even gave them gold and silver, jewellery and fine clothes to take with them, but still the king tried to stop them, and as soon as they had gone, he called out the army. The soldiers leapt into their swift light chariots and raced after the Israelites. By the time the Israelites reached the lakes and marshes near the border, the Egyptian army was close behind. There was water in front of them and soldiers behind them. The people were terrified, but Moses stretched out his arm and God sent an east wind. All night it blew, clearing a pathway through the water for the Israelites to cross in safety. But when the Egyptians tried to follow, the water rushed back and the king's whole army was drowned. So God saved his people and led them out of Egypt into freedom. "Where shall we meet for the Passover meal?" asked Jesus' friends on the morning of the festival. It was time to get things ready. "Go into the city," Jesus said. "You'll see a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him to his house. There is an upstairs room where we can have our meal together." That evening, before they sat down to eat, Jesus took a towel, poured some water into a basin, and began to wash their feet. This was a servant's job, and Peter was shocked. Jesus explained, "You must be willing to serve one another just as I have served you," he said. Jesus knew he would not be with them much longer. He was going to die. The friends could see that something was wrong. Jesus looked so sad. "One of you is going to betray me," he said at last. They were stunned. No one said anything for a minute. Then John, who was next to him, whispered to Jesus, "Who is it?" "The one to whom I give this piece of bread dipped in the sauce," Jesus answered. He gave it to Judas. "Go and do what you have to," Jesus said to him. So Jesus went out into the dark night. Jesus talked a lot that evening, and his friends never forgot his words. He told them how much he loved them, so much he was going to die for them. "I won't leave you on your own," he said. "God will send his Spirit to be with you and help you always. I am going back to God to get a place ready for you. Then I will come and take you to be with me. Don't worry, and don't be afraid." Jesus took a loaf of bread, thanked God for the food, and shared it round. "This is my body," he said. "I am going to be broken like this bread, to die, and I will be dying for you." Then he took a cup of wine, gave God thanks, and they all shared it. "This is my blood, poured out for many people. My death will seal the new peace between God and his people." When the meal was over, they left the house and walked to an orchard of olive trees called Gethsemane. On the way there, Jesus tried to warn his friends what would happen. "In just a few hours," he said, "you will all run away and leave me." "I never will," said Peter. But Jesus said, "Before the cock crows at dawn, you will say 3 times that you do not know me." "I would die first," Peter said. And they all agreed. When they came to Gethsemane, Jesus took Peter, James, and John in with him. The others sat down to wait. "Come with me and keep watch," he said to the 3. He was very upset. They moved in amongst the trees, and Jesus knelt to pray. "Father, if it's possible," he said, "save me from this death, but only if that's what you want." 3 times he prayed, and 3 times he went back to Peter, James, and John, and he found them asleep. The 3rd time he woke them. They could hear voices. People were coming. Torches flared. The temple guards and the chief priests, led by Judas, had come to arrest Jesus. "The one I kiss is the man you want," Jesus said to the soldiers. Then he went up to Jesus and kissed him. The soldiers closed in. Jesus did not try to escape or to resist them, but Peter drew his sword and he cut the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. "Put your sword away," Jesus said to Peter. And he touched the man's ear and healed it. Then he turned to the chief priests. "Why have you come against me with swords and clubs, as if I were a criminal?" he asked. There was no reply. The soldiers seized him roughly by the arms and marched him off. Every one of his friends ran off and left him.
Thank you to Daniel for reading those 2 stories to us. Now hopefully you will have perhaps realised the link as to why we have read those 2 stories. So yes, one is about Moses and the other one about Jesus. Now let's talk about Moses. Hopefully through the game, through the fair yo or fair no quiz, you will have heard and found out, if you didn't already know, some highlights from the story of Moses. Now before we get started, I want to ask you, what is the bravest thing you think you have ever done? What's the bravest thing you've ever done? Welcome back. Now I don't know how well you're doing with the Where We Are quiz. Hopefully something behind me might give you a clue as to where I am and where we've been today for this adventure. Now Moses, he doesn't necessarily strike you on the front of it as someone who's particularly courageous, and yet he really was. Now, was he courageous because he led God's people? Yes. Was he courageous because God told him what to do and he did it? Yes. Was he courageous because he went to Pharaoh? Yes. But for me, I think that one of the most courageous things that Moses did was accept the identity that God had given him. When God spoke to Moses in the burning bush, he said, Moses, here I am. And he told Moses to take off his shoes. Moses got to know God. But essentially, Moses accepted who God was. And through that, he accepted the identity that God had given him too. You see, because he knew whose he was, Moses knew who he was. And therefore, he could do all these amazing things. You see, for Moses, his identity must have been key, mustn't it? Because you think he was born an Israelite, he was raised an Egyptian, and then he ran away to be a nomad on a mountain looking after sheep. Can you imagine? He probably didn't know who he was or whose he was, who he belonged to. He didn't know who his real mum was until later. His identity would have been completely shaken and completely unknown. And yet there God is in the middle of a mountain, in the middle of a bush that's burning and yet not burning up. God calls his name. God knows who he is. You see, Moses might think that he has been hidden all this time and that no one knows who he is. And yet God knows exactly who he is. He knows exactly what his identity is. Is he Moses who killed an Egyptian? Not really. Is he Moses who ran away? No. Is he Moses, Pharaoh's grandson? No. Is he Moses, prophet and leader from God? Yes. That's exactly who he is. And that's exactly what God called him to do. Now, here's another quiz question for you. Can you name the 10 plagues? Off you go, have fun. Welcome back. I hope you had a good chance trying to work out what the 10 plagues were. Can you remember any of them? Boils, flies, lice, livestock. There's lots, isn't there? I'll put a slide up in just a second to let you know what they are. But notice when the slide comes up, what is the last one? It's quite a massive one, isn't it? It's a really sad one. Check out this list. You see, Moses had to go to Pharaoh not just once, not twice, but 10 times. And every so often, Pharaoh would give Moses a hint that this time it was going to be okay. This time he was going to be able to let his people go to celebrate in the desert, in the land of their people. And yet, every time Pharaoh said, no. Until finally God said, this time I will make Pharaoh listen. You see, in a lot of families, and in not just in ancient Egypt, but in a lot of families, the firstborn son was the one who inherited everything. They were the ones who were going to take on the family. They were going to have the family name. And therefore, to take away the oldest son, the firstborn son, what God was doing was saying, I'm going to shake the identity of your families for the next generation. Now, Moses had something separate for the people of Goshen, the Israelite people, the people of God. He said that if you took a perfect lamb and sacrificed it, ate bread, no yeast, you haven't got time to make bread to rise. That's why they don't have yeast in their bread. And with the blood of that lamb, I want you to smear it on the doorpost of your houses. And then when the angel of death passes over, to take away the firstborn son, he will see that sign. He will see that sign of a covenant between you and God, and he will not take your sons. You see, God was preserving the identity of his people. His people had something more than anyone else because they had him. Isn't that amazing? And you see, in a bit, we're going to come to celebrate the story of Passover that Jesus celebrated with his friends, which is why we celebrate communion. Jesus took that festival of the Passover lamb, of the angel of death passing over the people of Israel, and he took that to mean something so much more special and so much more amazing. So Moses led his people from Egypt. And it took them quite a while because they had to be led through day and night, the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And when they got to the shores of the Red Sea, they must have all panicked. Could you imagine being one of the Israelites? You've been trusted this prophet from God and he's led you away from Pharaoh, your oppressor, your captor, your slave master. And yet now you are trapped at the water's edge with Pharaoh's men closing in from behind. But is that where the story ends? Absolutely not. God takes his people and parts the Red Sea so that his people can pass right through it. You see, as they get to the river and God leads them through it, Moses is leading them from the captives and slave keepers, and he's freeing them to a life of freedom where they can find God's world and God's land and God's promises. And you see, that's exactly what Jesus does in communion, isn't it? It's exactly what he did on the cross for us. He took that Passover, made it create this beautiful new covenant between God and his people, to say that actually, just like Moses led his people from slavery to freedom, we are freed from the slavery of sin and being separated from God forever. So after this worship song, we're going to be sharing and celebrating communion together. If you want to use this song to get your things that you need together, that's fine, do that. If you want to use this song as a reflection of who God is, do that too. Because remember, unless you know whose you are, you'll never know who you are.